Hi, Alan. It's wonderful to have you in the podcast today. Alan Rowan is a Lacanian psychoanalyst and a member of the World Association of Psychoanalysis. He is also a chartered clinical psychologist and has published a variety of articles in the field of contemporary Lacanian psychoanalysis, and he's frequently invited to lectures on postgraduate and professional levels. Thank you, Alan, for accepting the invitation and being here today. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Nalini. Yes.
Yeah, how is it going, Alan, these days with regard to your work? Probably you are in Berlin now, right? If I'm right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, of course, like people everywhere, we have suffered lockdown. Things currently are not too bad in Germany. So obviously we had to stop seeing patients for about 7, maybe 8 weeks. Keeping up some contact online or via telephone. But in fact, we're allowed again to meet in person here in Berlin, which is great. It may come up later in our talk, but I mean, one of the interesting kind of phenomena is the use of Zoom and or internet to kind of keep up sessions for those who wished, and also kind of encountering the limitations of the internet in terms of analytic work. It's very important that two people meet, two bodies meet. And one of the things that, well, just to mention that one realizes very quickly is that analytic interventions, one really uses the body, one makes a movement, maybe moves closer to the patient or speaks in different tones of voice or makes a gesture or, let's say, allows a silence to continue or uses equivocal kind of language. And all of those interventions are very hard to do via the internet. And of course, there's a high level of visual contact as well, which is distracting really in terms of analytic work. So that's interesting. Yeah,
Absolutely. Alan, we'll start our discussion with giving our listeners and viewers a little bit of background about you and your work, and why Lacan's approach to understanding today's university is important. We'll just start with your kind of intervention as a psychoanalyst, especially in the Lacanian orientation.
Yes. Well, the first thing to say about Lacan, I think, is that following Freud, Lacan really emphasized the fact that, and built a whole theory around it, that we can define the human being as a speaking being. In other words, what is a human being? A human being is a user of language. And what that means is that the I, whoever I am, or you, that you are, let's say, already in language. There's no other way to talk about the subject except as a language using subject. And in fact, we are, you could say, in language even before we are born, because before the baby comes into the world, the baby is spoken about, is even named, and there are lots of words around that baby when the baby comes into the world. And these words can be welcoming or not so welcoming. And that has a big impact, let's say, on this baby who eventually encounters language at about, well, from 12 to 18 months, the first words get spoken. And what Lacan is saying here about language is that the language is not just about communication, but the words that the child or baby encounters, takes in from the outside, are the words by which it will, let's say, form its identity. So what is a subject? A subject is made of language.
Right.
And of course, the other side that Lacan brought to this was he was, let's say, there is also something outside of language or beyond language that is defining of a human being, and that is the body. And what he said is, what is the body? He said, it's an enjoying substance. It's the source of pain, pleasure, or Lacan's word was jouissance, enjoyment. But what he emphasized was that the connection between this body of pain, pleasure, this body of enjoyment, and the subject who speaks is contingent. It's not a given.
Okay.
And this connection has to be, let's say, forged between the, let's say, what the subject enjoys and their sense of identity, which they get through language. And so the language inside Lacan called the symbolic.
Yeah.
The body side he called the enjoying substance. The fact that the body enjoys, he called the real. And he also had a category called the imaginary. And the imaginary really is the unifying image that allows us to, how he put it was, to have a body.
Okay.
And what he meant by that was that the originary experience for the newborn baby is a fragmented experience. They don't have a sense of a unified body, and they only acquire a unified body, a sense of I am a body that represents me, let's say around that age again, around 18 months. And he had a name for this. It's called the mirror phase. So we acquire a body by identifying with our image, for example, as represented in a mirror, but also as reflected back to us from our primary caregivers. So that's there are three major categories that Lacan introduced, let's say, after Freud.
Yes.
You could say that Lacan is the psychoanalyst of the linguistic turn, the emphasis on language, which came to be prominent really in the 20th century. For example, with Saussure and linguists. And Freud, in a way, didn't have access to this emphasis on language, although he was extremely sensitive to language. So he did. So for example, I'll just give an example. If you look at, say, his paper on fetishism in 1927, it's a fascinating little paper, because in that Freud shows that a man who had a rather strange fetish, he was very attracted in German. The word glance means shine. He was very attracted to women who he felt had a particular sort of shine on their nose. Okay, that's what he was attracted to. And what Freud shows is that this word glance in German, why was he attracted to this shine that a woman had on a part of her face? And what Freud shows is that as a very young child, he was English speaking, lived in the UK rather than Germany, and he was completely preoccupied with, in English, glancing at the genitalia of the maid who lived in his house. Okay, so here you have glance in English and glance in German, two words which mean different things but sound the same. And to understand why this man had this strange fascination or fetish with shine on the face of a woman, you have to trace it back to a bit of language that was very important in his childhood. So it shows that how language not only kind of affects the subject in terms of their desires or their, but also beyond consciousness, because the man who was fascinated by the shine on a woman's face did not know the connection that was made, let's say, in his unconscious between the English word glance and the German word glance. So Freud was very sensitive to language. Like the rat man is another case where he has a particular fascination with a rat tortured that he's told by another officer in the army. And what Freud shows is that why was he fascinated with this rat torture story? Well, there's lots of connections. Ratten in German means rats, but he also had great difficulty, for example, the Ratman, the case, great trouble with his problems of getting married or not married. Well, the German word for to marry is heiraten. So you hear it again, the ratten. And this sensitivity to language is very important in psychoanalysis.
Absolutely. Alan, how could we bring the university discourse into this situation, like as how Lacan conceptualized it, like in terms of the other in terms of language and other discourses?
Sure. I think I'll try and get there. I think what I would have to say first is that discourse, language for Lacan is changes over time, changes in different cultures or different historical periods. So the language that we speak isn't static. And what it does is it allows one to have access to certain forms of expression or not through language. So what that means is that, for example, why were symptoms, let's say hysterical symptoms that Freud encountered, they were very different in Freud's time, in the Victorian time, the time of Charcot. So, for example, hysterics generally had, many had symptoms of paralysis, for example, or fainting, things that one doesn't really see very much in the 21st century. In the 21st century, we see things like, let's say, from the 1960s onwards or 70s onwards, one saw in Western cultures a lot of eating disorders, and in fact they continue to be prevalent, but they were extremely rare forms of suffering, in the 1900s. So what the symbolic, the socio-cultural whole within where language functions determines or allows, one can say, certain types of suffering, and for example, other types of suffering are not available to a subject. So you know, your habits, your suffering, your possibilities are defined within a language.
Mm-hmm.
So then you know, for example, I can put one more example, and then I'll turn to the university discourse. Today, one could say that the dominant, or one of the dominant, or perhaps the dominant discourse is the neoliberal capitalist discourse, of which I can say some more. But one consequence of that is that today the subject is, let's say, subjected to the trap or the tyranny, you could even say, of self-optimization. The self has become the object which you have to optimize. You have to make sure that you know, better health, better fitness, update your skill set. We're all pushed to optimize ourselves in the neoliberal capitalist, let's say, frame, symbolic frame. And of course, the other side of that is that we live in a culture where many people are exhausted by this. In other words, as the World Health Organization points out, I think depression is the second biggest disease, let's say, in the world after cardiovascular disease or disability, you could say. So people are more and more depressed, more and more burnt out, more and more exhausted. And it's partly because of this constant push to self-optimization. So that's an example of, again, how, let's say, the language system, the symbolic system that surrounds us, from which we make ourselves, our identity, our place in the world, in which we deploy, let's say, our desires, our drives, we find satisfactions or dissatisfactions in the world, which is made of this symbolic system, and it has consequences. So coming to university discourse, in 1969 to 1970, in Seminar 17, Lacan introduced what he called 4 discourses: the discourse of the university, the discourse of the master, the discourse of the hysteric, and the discourse of the analyst. So this is, let's say, trying to, it's quite complex, and I may not be able to explain it completely for your listeners. His idea was that 2 of these discourses were really about, on the subjective side, what is the analytic discourse, for example. And he has 4 positions in each discourse, starting with agency, other, the product of the discourse, and truth. So he's interested in how these things fit together. And in the place of agency, or the prime mover of a discourse, when he talks about the analytic discourse, he says that the prime mover of the analytic discourse is, he calls it object A, or lack. Okay. So let's say the analyst must be a cause of desire for the patient who comes, meaning that the analyst has to be in the position of being able to evoke, bring about not just the conscious desires of the patient, but also be that object which brings about, let's say, unconscious formations in the patient as well. The hysteric discourse is also a kind of subjective discourse. It doesn't mean the hysteric as a clinical category. The hysterics discourse is about a discourse of desire. How is the desiring subject situated in discourse? Okay, so there are two, and then the other two, the master discourse and the university discourse, are really on the side of the social. Okay, so they're not so much. Let's say they're not so much on the clinical side or the individual side. The discourse of the master for Lacan is the discourse that, well, I've just talked about the capitalist discourse or neoliberal capitalist discourse. This is the modern master, Lacan says. It is, in fact, the neoliberal capitalist discourse. It is the discourse that organizes your enjoyments, organizes your desires, facilitates certain forms of subjective identity, and pushes other forms of subjective identity to the margins. What's interesting about that is it's not the master discourse of old, which was more, let's say, regulatory. If you think of, say, in Victorian times, there were ways, it was very prescribed, let's say, the roles of men and women, marriage, and what was considered appropriate or not, and all many spheres of life. Whereas today, what we see is the master discourse, calling the capitalist discourse as master discourse, is rather limitless. There's not so prescribed, as Lacan said in the more than 50 years ago, and this is a very important point. He said, Freud's superego, which was full of injunctions about how to be, what's the proper way to be in the world, and prohibitions, what you couldn't enjoy, desire, be. He said, the Freudian superego no longer exists. And he said the superego, the modern superego, says simply enjoy. You can. In fact, it says you can, therefore you must. So, but it has this limitless quality to it. So that's something about the master discourse today. The university discourse, the prime mover of the university discourse for Lacan was what he called S2, not a master signifier. In the place of agency, like I said on the top left-hand corner, he put S2 or knowledge. So knowledge is the prime mover in the university discourse. And let's say a good example of the university discourse, there are many forms of university discourse, many particular disciplines, but a good example would be science. Science privileges above all knowledge. It is a knowledge, it's about the production of knowledge. And the issue for Lacan with the university discourse, which of course is all around us today, it's what we have apps, we have the internet, we're knowledge is everywhere. and we use it to not just in terms of the university as an institution, but we're engaged with the university discourse in life as well.
Right.
Not, of course. An example is how we turn to science all the time in terms of trying to, let's say, help us make decisions on how to live. So the problem with the university discourse for Lacan is that it privileges, I'll say something about science in a moment, but it privileges the accumulation of knowledge, kind of sedimented knowledge. It turns the subject or the student into a kind of depository for knowledge, a kind of, the fantasy that some universities have now, and partly because of the pandemic, is that they can go online and simply transfer information to students. Okay, so you acquire this information. It's a kind of sedimented knowledge.
Yes.
The problem with this is that Lacan says with the university discourse, what tends to be elided, what tends to be not engaged with is, let's say, subject's desire, or the master signifiers would be another term, the defining nature of the subject, their inner nature. So the university discourse has this tendency, okay, to let's say deal in the transfer of knowledge, pushing to one side the question of desire. In other words, I can put it this way, maybe taking science as an example. Science, Lacan famously said, is headless. It's an absolutely amazing thing that we have science, as we know. We're waiting for the vaccine to resolve or help us with this pandemic. It's absolutely amazing that science is able to invent and develop in the ways it has, and we have computers. We have our lives are covered with the products of science.
Yeah.
But ultimately, Lacan says it's headless in that the next invention or the next development in science, we don't know if it's good for human beings or not. In other words, we can clone now, we can clone life, we can make doubles of our bodies, as has been done in the famous experiment with the cloning of sheep. And so we can clone. But this knowledge in the service of human life or not, we don't know. At least it's a big question, you know. So science invents or finds out how to clone, and then we come to the question of, well, we have this knowledge, but how do we deploy it? How do we use it? Is it enhancing of human life or not? So science is just going to go on and on, finding out more and more things, but it's the question of how they work in human life, how this knowledge works, is another question.
Yeah, and also the fact that in the university discourse, other strains such as the neoliberalism, the kind of right-wing fascism. So all these kind of ideologies have now shaped what university is today, and it has become no longer a space where you provide, you provide, some room for radical interventions, radical talk, or any democratic kind of participation. So, taking this on board, what has happened to the humanities and the social sciences, when this kind of science as a discourse has and neoliberalism has invaded the university space, and or rather university space has appropriated these discourses. What how do you describe, or how do you explain the function of the humanities and social sciences today at the university space?
Mm. It's a big question, obviously, but the first answer would be to say that we can again appeal to the neoliberal capitalist dominant discourse of our time, insofar as what has happened is that, and we see it in the language of universities. I was for a few years a lecturer in Middlesex University in the UK, and it was a moment when students became customers.
Yeah.
Okay. That seemed to me quite bizarre at the time, but you see that it is the language of capital. These are customers who purchase something in the university. In other words, they consume. And of course, once you start introducing that language, it's the idea that they consume something that has market value, something that optimizes them for the marketplace, for the future capacity to earn and survive in the capitalist market. And in fact, the language of business at that time in the UK, and it continues, very much said that universities should be producing the workforce that we need, usually for the future, that's their role. And this is a terrible distortion and a terrible loss, and it's squeezed out both from the point of view of the user, the student, but also from this force coming from business and government about the function of universities. It squeezed the humanities and social sciences, and let's say the value of seeing a university as or study, a period of study, as really a place of exploration, a place to, let's say, not consume knowledge, but contemplate knowledge, a place to, let's say, enrich your soul rather than acquire a skill set or something like that that you can deploy in the market. So this is quite a big shift, and I have to say, not a good shift. And we have to, for example, again, I'll talk about the 90s when I was teaching at university in the UK. Margaret Thatcher, the then Prime Minister in the UK, was famously really against social sciences.
Okay.
And she actively reduced the funding of social sciences in the universities. Why? Precisely because within the social sciences, you had, let's say, always a developed critique of the neoliberal position, and reducing funding reduced that, let's say, the social sciences ability to foster, maintain, and you could even say spread this critical, this critique of neoliberalism.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
there's a very active move against humanities and against the idea that, you know, having or studying in university is a development of the self, not a let's say where you just to acquire skills, make yourself more scalable.
I'm kind of moving on to you know, a very specialized kind of an area where I would like to discuss how you know, fields like cultural studies have actively, you know, used theories of Lacan, especially, or like, you know, psychoanalysis, in their, you know, in their fields. So it's kind of probably not in a very full-fledged way, at least in the context of Sri Lanka. But you know, as a theoretical frame, how do you see this appropriation of the psychoanalytic thought in cultural and in a field like cultural studies, English studies, and all that?
Yes, I mean, I think that's very true in various places. So one of the like really interesting things, to take America as an example, but it's true of Britain as well and other places, that Lacan has been taken up more in cultural studies than clinically, whereas in European countries, really psychoanalysis, Lacanian psychoanalysis, is clinical practice, which doesn't mean it doesn't have cultural impacts or involve itself in cultural debates. I think it's a fruitful, can be a fruitful deployment of psychoanalytic thinking, because the categories I mentioned in the beginning, like the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real, just to take three notions from Lacan, are extremely powerful, let's say, tools that you can bring to bear on various things. Like, for example, Lacan was very popular, although less so now, in film studies.
Yeah.
So, as using analytic concepts to, let's say, examine the position of the viewer, but also the filmic effect and the sorts of, let's say, filmic narratives that one finds in films. What is beyond the entertainment? What is the, let's say, core thing in the film beyond the immediate images that satisfy that what is it that the subject is enjoying in the film. So yeah, and in a way we've already been talking about you know, because we haven't been talking clinically, you know, when we talk about the sociocultural space the subject finds itself in the 21st century is an application of psychoanalysis to culture.
How do you see the development of the psychoanalytic thought, especially in your context, outside the space of university, outside the academic space, especially as a mode of inquiry, or you know, as a space where you can reflect, contemplate on, you know, on the aspects of society and culture.
Yes, that's that. One of the things that's quite important. One point quite important to make is that many people think of psychoanalysis as a static body. In fact, you know, find people who think that Freud is out of date. But psychoanalysis is not static and cannot be static for one of the reasons I mentioned earlier. The socio-cultural other shifts constantly. And in response to that, psychoanalysts who, let's say, encounter their patients, learn from their patients, and bring that knowledge, that learning that comes from the clinic into the theory. And of course, that's a kind of cycle, the cycle between clinical practice and theory and the back and forth. So theory, psychoanalytic theory is contrary, as I say, to some popular ideas of it, constantly evolving. And for example, Freud was able to make Oedipal type interpretations to his patients, which of course had a dramatic impact at the time. If you said, as Freud said, to say a patient who has difficulties in his relationship with women, and Freud says, well, the difficulty is because the image of your mother comes between you and the woman, or something like this. But of course, you can't say that to anybody anymore. It's old. Everybody knows. It's a kind of dinner party joke. Oedipal kind of relations, or it's all about your father, or it's all about your mother. So in the actual practice of analysis, the technique, the actual clinical practice has changed. The patients who come to analysis have changed. In terms of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, for example, since the 1960s, in their terms, you see the growth in what they term personality disorders. Lacanians, we do not operate with those categories that are in those manuals, which are extremely phenomenologically based on the phenomena, and emphasize, in fact, the affective state of patients. So we operate more with the structure, the underlying structure. So, for example, if somebody comes to see us who's depressed, we want to know, well, okay, that's the phenomena, depression, but is this an obsessional person who's depressed? Is it a hysteric person who's depressed? Is it a psychotic person who's depressed? What's the underlying clinical structure with the phenomena is unfolding? And I say that because maybe a roundabout way, but one of the developments of Lacanian theory in the last 20, 25 years that's been very important is the development of a theory of ordinary psychosis. That's a new category that wasn't in Lacan himself, although maybe some hints towards that. Well, more than hints in the seminar on Joyce. But the idea is that a person can have a psychotic structure, and I can say more about what that is. In other words, it's not a neurotic structure, but a psychotic structure, and can be stable within that structure. In other words, they never trigger, they never go mad, but the underlying structure is psychotic. And to say what that means is probably going to take us into more and more theory, but basically what it means is that what Lacan calls the name of the father, the act of the father separating the child from the mother, and the mother from the child, which doesn't have to be a real actual father in Lacan. Way of thinking about it is rather a symbolic function. So the name of the father doesn't have to be a man, it doesn't have to be the actual father, but this act, this symbolic act of separation, which Lacan also calls the paternal function. If doesn't happen, it is what, let's say, that intervention starts to say. It's the first point at which the child encounters, let's say, a no. No, you can't satisfy your desire in this way. Let's say you cannot have the mother as object, but also this no of the father contains a kind of yes, which comes second, which is, but yes, you can have other things. So it's the first moment where, let's say, an intervention regulating jouissance and desire happens.
Right.
The idea with psychosis is that that particular intervention doesn't happen, and therefore that the, let's say, stabilization of the subject has to happen by other means. I may have to.
Yeah. Alan will also talk about the need to or need for psychoanalysis to be contemporary at this moment of time, because one of the things that I've heard in many academic circles is that Lacan is not relevant to the contemporary scholarship, and we should just let Lacan, Freud be. How do you think how do you think this this contemporary thought resonates with how what we need to do in terms of psychoanalytic thought, making it more contemporary, making it more relevant, not just for the academic circles, but for people, for anyone outside, outside the academia.
Yes. Well, I think there's a lot of possible answers to that question, insofar as everybody wants to protect their own turf would be one answer. Disciplines establish themselves on the basis of ring fencing their knowledge claims. So there are some ring fenced knowledge claims that don't want the disturbance of dealing with, let's say, psychoanalytic or Lacanian challenge. But also, like, I can take it, I come from a psychology background. So one of the things that one sees in psychology outside the university, but also inside the university, is, let's say, the industrialization of therapy.
Okay.
And the industrialization of therapy happens on the back of something called the prioritizing and privileging of so-called evidence-based therapy.
Okay.
Okay. And more and more clinicians today, especially, for example, in the UK where I worked, more and more treatments, more and more psychological treatments are delivered on the basis that they're evidence-based. And that means they're usually cognitive behavioral therapy. Okay. So when you meet clinicians or students of psychology in, let's say, especially the UK, they believe that psychoanalysis is not only old hat, but it doesn't work, and it's completely irrelevant to psychology.
Okay.
So, and in fact, the let's say, the presence of psychoanalytic orientation within the National Health Service in the UK has reduced and reduced.
Okay.
Because the evidence base isn't there. This is absolutely detrimental, because what is happening with this evidence base? Well, first of all, because it's based on what are called randomized controlled trials. Okay, so they take a sample of people, they try a therapy, they look at the results. Most randomized controlled trials last between 6 and 16 weeks.
Okay.
most people who suffer a mental health problem, their suffering lasts a lot longer. So the
Yeah.
average, say, a serious depression is at least a year on average. So these interventions that are tried out for 6 to 16 weeks, they don't really address that
Yeah.
patient. And of course, also there's huge biases in terms of selection. So when you're doing your randomized controlled trial and you're saying, okay, we're going to be scientific here, you want people in your sample who have only depression, because you want to test a treatment for depression. So you don't want people who actually are real patients. In other words, somebody who had an eating disorder in the past, who maybe has some drug problems and issues as a single mother, a difficult child, or attachment issues with her child. That's a real patient. Those patients are never come into clinical trials because they're too complex. So the results of clinical trials, which were then told, according to the evidence base, are effective treatments, but for who? Not real world patients. So there's lots of these distortions that happen. In this case, that tell us that, maybe psychoanalysis, but also other forms of other theoretical and clinical practices are not relevant. But we have to look at the distortion that happens in reaching those conclusions. So whether it's a distortion because you've got your boundary, let's say, around your knowledge area, whether it's a distortion, like I've just explained, in the name of science, or whether it's just that more and more we've all got into our micro disciplines and we don't talk across disciplines.
Yeah.
These are all, I would say, bad reasons to downplay the importance, not just of Lacanian practice and theory, but also perhaps other practice and theory. We've stopped engaging. There's a lack of intellectual engagement. In fact, intellectuals all over are more or less frowned on. Not just do you have with the pandemic the dismissal of science by some, but the idea that we need, let's say, not just experts in narrow categories of expertise, but that we need to be engaging in a wide spectrum of intellectual activity as human beings.
Absolutely.
And that is something that's harder to maintain today somehow. Kind of, yeah.
Absolutely. As a last point, Alan, we'll discuss about your engagement as a psychoanalyst. Especially, you are one of the founders of the Irish Circle of Lacanian Orientation, and I think it does a lot of work in terms of initiating discussion outside the academia about the clinic, its potential, and everything. We'll discuss about your engagement, Alan, and also how you kind of navigate these boundaries, these disciplinary boundaries, and the limitations that the contemporary academia gives or imposes on the Lacanian theory and its practice.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think one thing that has happened for Lacanians in general is that we have reached a point where we know that we have to speak more into the to the cultural and socio-political environment that we find ourselves within. And Jacques-Alain Miller, who's very important Lacanian, the most important Lacanian after Lacan, several years ago, when the Le Pen in France was running for the presidency of France, came out and said, well, we can't go along with that. We can't go along with fascism. And in fact, we can't go along with it, not just because it's bad for human beings, but we can't go along with it because psychoanalysis can't exist under fascism. Psychoanalysis is based on the idea that you speak freely, that there's no prohibition on what you say in the psychoanalytic space, that in fact you speak of exactly what you feel you can't say. In other words, I can give a definition of the unconscious here, which is brief but nice. The unconscious is what you don't want to know about yourself. So it's precisely this play between knowing and not knowing as a subject that psychoanalysis is focused on. But anyway, Jacques-Alain Miller came out and said, we can't support this. We have to speak out. Right. And he had a really wonderful initiative, which was Lacanians all over France. What they did was they didn't march as such, but they created conversations or spaces where they brought together, let's say, academic people or counselors or the mayor of a town or village or public officials, and created spaces where there was a discourse, a dialogue possible about political questions, about social questions. And more we have to make those spaces exist. And we are in difficult times, as we see, and we're in difficult times precisely because the master signifiers of old no longer work. These great organizing signifiers of life. In America today, America 50 years ago, it was very clear that you were patriotic, you were a Democrat, and you were anti-communist. If you ask in today this master signifier of being a patriot, like what is a patriot in America today? Well, there's no answer to that. There are multiple answers. And what a patriot means, if you are part of Black Lives Matter and if you're part of the far right, are completely different things. So you see all of these master signifiers and, let's say, taking on many different answers and really becoming the master signifiers today really function in groupings, small groups like the far right or a particular part of the far right or movements, and people identify with these movements, but there's not an overall, let's say, societal ideal in the way there was. So we have to get into these, let's say, a politics or social spaces where we can talk to each other. The tragedy of America, as you see, is that you could say that one of the things that's happened to politics there is the Democrats and the Republicans can no longer talk to each other. They just insult each other. So you see what happens when the space of talking or curiosity or exploration goes. It creates the worst.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alan. Thank you so much for being here today. Any final thoughts or remarks that you would like to add before we wind up the session today?
Well, I think that, like many people, the great question that we're facing is whether after this pandemic, with the much greater threat of climate change on the horizon, whether we are going to be able to put some block on the capitalist accumulative culture that we live in, which, as Zygmunt Bauman pointed out, a very important point, is increasingly creating, and it's going to create a lot more human waste. And that's a very strong concept. But what he meant was humans who aren't just unemployed, like in the 1950s and historically, you always had unemployed portion of the population who were unemployed. But they also became re-employed. They were employable. And when the economy took up or a new factory or something happened, they were taken up again into employment. But what he means by human waste is human beings that are never going to be employed. They're never going to be able to get into that category of employability because their skill set or their for various reasons, they're pushed to the margins. And this is with automation, which is coming, driverless cars, whatever, more and more people, less and less jobs. So we're heading for climate crisis, post-pandemic. What do we do to prevent future ones? What are we going to do with a human society where human waste, to use this provocative term, becomes a problem? In other words, are we going to find a way to make our world more humane, more livable for humans? It's going to take a huge, and one can hope, but also it may not happen, a huge shift, a kind of new politics, a kind of politics that puts not capital first, but this question first of what is a humane society, what are humane forms of life, and that touches back on some of the things we've talked about it means taking a perspective on knowledge or knowledge production, science, various other things.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you so much for being here today. I think this is going to be a new experience, especially for the Sri Lankan audience, because we rarely talk about the Lacanian orientation here, and even in psychology, I guess. So I think it's a good experience, and having this conversation will trigger people to read Lacan more and to read Freud more, and yeah. Thank you, Alan, for being here, and it was an honor having you. And I wish you all the best for all your endeavors that you are engaged in at the moment. Thank you so much. We'll meet
very
soon.
much to me.
Yeah.
Thank you.